Hey everyone, welcome back to Engelbart Gaming. After straying into some new territory for a bit, I figured it was time for another video in one of my more traditional series. So here we are, 11 facts about the Sega Game Gear that you maybe didn't know. I'll have a few on here that, well, most people know, just to make this video accessible for everyone, and then we'll delve into weirder territory. For this one, I'll show you some different screen sizes here and there, since looking at a Game Gear screen full size can be a bit much. But if you're watching this video on a mobile device, it's probably not too bad. Enough talk, let's get on with it. The Game Gear launched in Japan in October of 1990, and North America and Europe in April of 1991. We'll kick this off with the basics. Sega's Game Gear, which was developed under the codename Project Mercury, debuted at the Tokyo Toy Show in June of 1990. After it was shown off there for the very first time, Sega released their first portable system ever in Japan on October 6th of 1990, with columns packed in for 19,800 yen, or approximately $147 at the exchange rate at the time. Next up, the fun part. For the US, the launch date is kind of murky and depended on where you were. Sega debuted the Game Gear in the US at an event at the US Intrepid Air Force carrier, which is docked in New York on April 5th. It's a museum now. Side note, I visited the Intrepid, but it was years before that event. After that, the system launched in New York City and LA on April 15th, 1991, and it seems the rest of the country started seeing it on April 26th of 1991. The system cost $149.99, and Columns was once again the pack-in title. Sometime that same April, the system also debuted in most of Europe. For the UK release, it was £99.99, as with the other regions, the pack-in was Columns. Yeah, Sega had been rightly inspired by the success of the Game Boy, and it had come packed with Tetris, so that's why they chose Columns for the Game Gear. Sega of America applied its unique for the time advertising style to the Game Gear and went all in to try and crush the Game Boy. In the end, well, we all know how that turned out, but we'll see the extent of it in a little while. It's a portable Sega Master System, but better. I'll go into another one that many of you probably know, and that's that the hardware inside the Game Gear is based on Sega's 8-bit home console, the Master System, which was also known as the Mark III in Japan. But is it exactly the same?
No.
It sure isn't. It has a few benefits that the original Master System did not. First up, colors. The Sega Master System had a total palette of only 64 colors. Out of those 64 colors, it could display 32 on the screen at once, which is really good for an 8-bit system of its age. So what about the Game Gear then? Well, it can still only display 32 colors on the screen at once. However, the total palette got just a little bit of an upgrade, going from 64 colors up to 4,096. That's 8 times more colors than the total palette of the Sega Genesis/Mega Drive. So if you were wondering why some Game Gear games look a little more vibrant than SMS titles, well, there's your answer to that one. Next up, sound. The Master System and Game Gear have the same sound chip, an ancient, crusty old SN76489 PSG. This thing is so old, it was in the ColecoVision. On the Sega Master System, you originally only got mono sound, but on the Game Gear, it got updated to stereo sound, with one caveat. You had to use headphones to get stereo sound, since the Game Gear itself only had one mono speaker. You could play Sega Master System cartridges directly on a Game Gear. Yeah, I know I talked about this one a bit in my SMS 10 Facts video, but it fits here too, and I know people would complain if I left it out, so here we are. With a handy-dandy official converter from Sega called the Master Gear, you could play your SMS games directly on a Game Gear. Yes, this was a bit bulky and unwieldy, but hey, you just opened up a lot of extra titles for your system. In the early days of the Game Gear, this was a great option to have. Compatibility was good, but not 100%. For example, Phantasy Star, Outrun, and just a few others didn't work right on the Master Gear, suffering from severe flicker, missing graphics, and other issues. Phantasy Star even had sometimes issues where cartridges would get wiped and lose their saves. Of course, as time went on, there were other Master System converters, including ones offered by other companies. There's the creatively named Gear Master converter, the Master Gear adapter, the Newbie converter, and probably some others. One note here, if you have a later model Game Gear, one from the Majesco era, most of these adapters won't work on your Game Gear at all. Generally speaking, unless there's another one I haven't come across yet, the only converter that seems to work with all models of Game Gear, including Majesco's, is the Newbie converter. The Game Gear is a huge battery hog. The Sega Game Gear required 6, yes you heard that right, 6 AA batteries. And with those 6 AA batteries, you got approximately 3 hours of battery life out of them. Might be a little bit more if you were lucky. Might get to 4 or all the way up to 5. Now this was really similar to the Atari Lynx, which has its own 11 Facts video if you want to check that out. Now you could alleviate this battery problem by buying an AC adapter of course, but then your portable system needed to be tethered to a wall and suddenly became a lot less portable. Now with the battery situation, you might be thinking to yourself, sure, those were 1990s batteries. What about my fancy batteries in the year 2026? You can safely use several kinds of rechargeable batteries in a Game Gear, but you might be tempted to try regular disposable lithium AA's. Don't do that. Their voltage is slightly higher, and that could lead to big trouble. Now, I won't detail mods for Game Gear too much here, but it's becoming common to replace the old washed out and frankly terrible Game Gear LCD screen with a more modern one. Doing that can yield much better battery life. How much better? Often about up to 3 times or so better. If you replace the screen and use some modern rechargeables, you might get around 8 to 10 hours of battery life from your Game Gear, depending on the batteries you're using. And there's lots of Game Gear mods out there today. I could do a whole video on that alone. You could buy a TV tuner for your Game Gear. Playing games is great and all, but if you wanted a more passive, lazy form of entertainment on your Game Gear, well, you could just go out and buy the Game Gear TV tuner. And if you thought the battery life was terrible on the Game Gear alone, well, the TV tuner wants you to hold its beer. And on top of that, if you weren't in an area with great TV reception, you could expect all of the normal over-the-air TV problems of the day, like snow and static, tuning problems, and the like. And how much did it cost for the honor of watching fuzzy TV on a tiny washed-out screen when this thing launched in the US in 1991? Well, it went for $119.99, which we'll just call it 120 bucks. And I'd be willing to bet that most of the people who spent 120 bucks on this back in the day, they probably bought it, used it a couple of times, and then never touched it again, making it a very expensive paperweight. But I'll turn this over to you guys, the viewers. Did any of you have a Game Gear tuner back in the early 90s when it was new? Did you use it often? Let me know in the comments. This is one peripheral I have never owned. Anyway, the postscript to this story of the device is that these days the TV tuner is essentially worthless. The analog frequencies that this ran off of in this country, and I'd imagine most others, are no longer used for that purpose, which essentially is a fancy way of saying you can no longer watch TV on this TV tuner. So if you own or buy one at this point, you've got yourself a neat little conversation piece and collectible, but that's pretty much it. Approximately 12 million Game Gear systems were sold in its lifetime. You might think, based on what you've heard elsewhere out there on the internet, that the Game Gear was an absolute failure. If you think that, well, you're wrong! The Game Gear sold pretty well during its lifetime. It wasn't quite the gigantic hit that Sega was hoping for, and there are a lot of reasons for that, some of which we've already covered here, but the Game Gear was still the best-selling portable system that wasn't from Nintendo all the way until the release of the PSP in 2004. Yeah, Nintendo absolutely dominated the handheld market for as long as it's existed. Anyway, the lowest estimates for the Game Gear are around the 10.6 million unit range, while the highest ones are a little over 12 million. Let's be optimistic and go with a higher number and call it 12 million. That's just 1 million under the PlayStation Vita. And I think it's safe to say that the Vita is regarded as a much bigger quote-unquote failure than the Game Gear was. Especially when you consider PSP sales. But getting back to the point here, Sega continued making Game Gears all the way until the end of April 1997. Now, how did some of the other portable systems do in comparison from different companies? And we'll look at systems only not from Nintendo for this section. So after the Game Gear, the best-selling system from another company is the WonderSwan and its variants, coming in at about 3.5 million units. Right after that is, get ready for this one, the Nokia N-Gage. The old Taco phone and its update sold about 3 million units. And then the beloved but niche Neo Geo Pocket sold about 2 million units, and the Neo Geo Pocket Color, its update, sold incredibly less than that. So in the grand scheme of things, the Game Gear did okay, but the Game Boy did insane numbers. There was nobody who could touch it. There are approximately 390 official Game Gear games, and you could play them all. The Game Gear has a fair amount of games released for it. It has a much better and larger library than some of the systems I've looked at in this series previously. There are about 390 total Game Gear games if we count region duplicates and the like. The best part is, if you wanted to play a game that didn't come to your region, well you could, because the Game Gear was completely region-free. Now what kind of games were worth playing from other regions? Well, if you can read Japanese, there were plenty of strategy RPGs for the system in particular. It had the 3 Shining Force Gaiden games, of which we only got the second in English. We had Royal Stone, Zangier, and more. Standard RPGs like Phantasy Star Gaiden, the 2 Magic Knight Ray Earth games, Eternal Legend, Lunar Strolling School, the 3 Mado Monogatari games, Megami Tensei, Last Bible, and more. And for anyone who doesn't read Japanese, there are plenty of other games they could have played, like Mappy, Gigi Alesta, Alien Syndrome, and Pengo, which both came out in Japan and Europe, but not the US. We had Sonic Drift, Puyo Puyo 2, Kinetic Connection, Gunstar Heroes, Tails Sky Patrol, and more. And you know what? Let's jump right back into those RPG-style games I mentioned, plus a few more for my next fact. There are lots of translated Game Gear games. Now, if you're big into emulation and have been for a long time, which I imagine describes many people watching this, you might already know about a lot of these. But if you're newer to the scene and you love the Game Gear, well, you're in for a treat. There are quite a lot of fan translations available for the system, more than you'd expect if you didn't know its scene very well. Let's take a quick peek at just a few. First, here's Shining Force Gaiden 3, it's probably the biggie and best known of them. This game is only available on the Game Gear, so this fan translation is the only way to play it in English. It's more related to Shining Force 2 on the Genesis story-wise than the previous Game Gear titles. Here's Phantasy Star Gaiden, which is great for quelling your curiosity about the title, but it's honestly not a very good game. The encounter rate for this one for random battles is insane. Next up, here's Sylvan Tale. It's an action RPG that's actually pretty damn good despite not being a known quantity. And here's Lunar Sanpo-Suru Gakuen, or Strolling School, for the Game Gear. I'm afraid this is another big game where the game is actually just pretty so-so. You can play the Magic Knight Ray Earth games in English. We also have Frey, all of the Mado Monogatari or Sorcery Saga games, Eternal Legend, which isn't too bad and something I reviewed on the channel years ago, and there's even a Sailor Moon translation, among many others. As I record this, there are roughly 28 unique games translated fully into English for the platform, so track them down, give them a try, knock yourself out. The Game Gear had its share of wacky accessories. The Game Gear doesn't have as many nutso accessories as the Nintendo portable systems, but it was popular enough that it had more than a few of them. Now before we go on, if you've never seen a Game Gear in person, it's pretty big and bulky, so anything that added to the heft was going to create something seriously huge, like this battery pack from Sega called the Power Back. Yeah, I'm going to leave that name alone. This peripheral was only released in Japan and the US. We also have the Handy Gear, that transformed your Game Gear into a hilariously giant brick. There were loads of screen magnifiers, just like for the original Game Boy. Eventually, there was even this stereo FM tuner from a few different companies. And while I never owned this one, I love the idea of the Solar Gear, which was supposed to get charged up with a solar panel so that you didn't need to use batteries in your Game Gear. Solar tech wasn't particularly great all the way back in 1993 when this accessory came out, so it was probably crap, but I don't know from personal experience. Did any of you guys watching own this? Let me know in the comments how it was if you did. Finally, here's another one, the Wide Gear, Sega's very own official screen magnifier, which is known for being kind of awful since it only had one attachment point to the Game Gear and floated above it otherwise. Sega realized it was garbage and eventually stopped making wide gears and instead made newfangled super wide gears. And the super wide gear had a much more secure connection to the system. There was an official third-party release of the Game Gear from Majesco in 2001. 10 years after the Game Gear was released and about 4 years after Sega discontinued it, Majesco stepped up to manufacture and distribute a new cost-reduced version of the Game Gear. How cost-reduced? Majesco was selling these guys for $30 brand new. And who knows, they might have had some big success with this had Nintendo not released the Game Boy Advance that same year. So, what was changed in these models versus the Sega original? Well, let's talk cosmetics first. The shell is darker than the original Sega units. They got rid of the color above the Game Gear logo, making it entirely monochrome. Likewise for the text under the Sega logo, which is now all white. They put super cheap white labels on the back of the units. The power switch is now black instead of red, and the hole that you would screw accessories into, like the Master Gear converter, is completely filled in. And hey, maybe that last part is good, because it prevented you from screwing in a bunch of accessories that didn't work, like Master System converters. Unfortunately, it also stopped a few accessories that did, like the Super Wide Boy. I should also mention that the TV tuner did not work on these units back in its own time at all. If you wanted to play Game Gear games back in 2001 or play them again at that time, it's hard to argue this was not a great deal at $30. Majesco apparently sold about 1.5 million of these re-released Game Gears. According to price charting, the most expensive Game Gear game right now is Kawasaki's Superbike Challenge. Like always, I'll end this 11 facts video with the most expensive game for the system, as I record this video at the end of June 2026. If we head on over to price charting, we see that the most expensive Game Gear game right now, at least brand new, is Kawasaki's Superbike Challenge. If anyone can find this thing new, it goes for the bargain basement price of $3,420. If you're a little strapped at the moment, well that's okay. You can get a complete in-box second-hand copy for a mere $1,900 and some change. But here's the really actually crazy part. I joke about these prices in these videos, but look at this. The loose price of this game is $16.50. Yeesh, I have never seen that big a discrepancy in the new, complete in-box, and loose prices. So this one, yeah, you actually could afford to buy it loose. Probably. But let's see if that's a fluke. The next most expensive brand new game is Mega Man. Now this one, if you didn't know, is based mostly on levels and characters from NES Mega Man's 4 and 5. It's a decent game. Is it $3,108 decent? Absolutely not. Complete in box copies go for $1,727. And here we go, that's more normal. The loose price is $256.41. But look at this, there are 8 Game Gear titles that currently sell at new prices above $1,000, which really kind of surprised me. Now the most expensive Game Gear hardware is the Blue Game Gear, which is commonly known here as the Sega Sports model since it came with World Series Baseball. However, you could also buy the same color Game Gear with a different pack-in game, Lion King. And as crazy as this next part might seem, this was the only color other than black available in the US, and it was only available for about 1 year. So yeah, it's $2,000 new in box if you can find it, $600 complete in box, and about $200 loose. That loose price includes almost $40 in shipping fees. Bonus fact. What's this, a 12th fact? Is that even allowed? I'm just including this because I know this is something else where if I don't talk about it, people are going to say, hey, why didn't you mention this? And it's technically not even the same hardware, so it's okay. It's only sort of a Game Gear fact. Sega released, in Japan only, the Game Gear Micro, which came in 4 common variants and 1 rarer one. Really kind of 4.5. So what do I mean by that? Well, these little functional Game Gears came with only 4 games preloaded on each and you couldn't put any more on it. If you ordered all 4 of them, you got a bonus 5th smoky transparent color. Now the kicker here is that the screen and controls are so small that these aren't exactly usable in practice. But then there's also a rare 5th model, the DX Pack, which is also known as the Alesta Collection, and it includes GG Alesta, GG Alesta 2, GG Alesta 3, Power Strike, and Power Strike 2. How did one acquire this tiny little shooter machine? Well, it came with either the PS4 or Nintendo Switch versions of the Alesta Collection. It's super expensive to track down secondhand these days. Alright, back to our regularly scheduled conclusion. So let's wrap this one up. The Game Gear is a fun, underrated system. I've seen some people say it was ahead of its time, but to those people I say, no. I can think of few other systems that were so of their time. It used older components even by 1991 standards to try and keep prices low, but those power-hungry chips and screen also meant that the experience of actually using a Game Gear was far less than ideal. The infamously blurry screen that ghosted all over the place really made it hard to see what was going on in a lot of games like Sonic, and it may actually be the thing that hurt it the most experience-wise. There are lots of modern mods for the Game Gear like I mentioned earlier, so you can put in things like fancy new LCD screens, rechargeable batteries, and there's even an EverDrive for it. So in the end, the Game Gear has plenty of good games on it, more than enough to justify its existence. If you've never played a Game Gear or its games, I say look into it. The Shinobi games, the Sonic games, the GG Alesta games, the translated RPGs, and many more are absolutely still worth playing today. So tell me, do you think I left anything out especially interesting or important about the Game Gear? Did you have one back in the day? What games did you play on it when it was new? Are you upset I didn't include the gold one? Let me know in the comments. That brings us to the end of another video, my retro gaming friends. If you enjoyed it, please like and share it online somewhere. It's the only way my little channel here can grow. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any of my videos. If you want to be super cool and support the work that I do here, you can do that on Patreon, Ko-fi, or right here on YouTube through Super Thanks or channel memberships. With that, I'll say thanks for watching, and see me later.